Little MAGA girl banned from library for Trump book. But one wee vet appeared and subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from. The Oak Creek Public Library used to be a temple of reverent silence and accumulated wisdom, a place where the scent of old paper and lemonwood polish mingled with the promise of infinite worlds waiting to be discovered. For Emily, a girl of just 14 with a heart that beat in sync with her family's traditional values, that red brick building had always been a sanctuary. However, on that Tuesday afternoon, the atmosphere seemed to have shifted, charged with a hostile, static electricity, as if the walls themselves had picked a side in an invisible war the young girl was barely beginning to understand. Emily walked through the aisles with the lightness of someone trying not to be a bother, her pale yellow sundress clashing with the aggressive modernity beginning to invade the space. A pink ribbon tied back her blonde hair, a symbol of childhood innocence that modern society seemed eager to corrupt or destroy. She wasn't there to cause a scene, nor to challenge anyone. She was there only in search of the truth, a lonely and courageous quest for a teenager in such polarized times. Her quiet steps led her to the political science and American history section, a corner of the library that lately seemed increasingly neglected, with dusty shelves and dim lighting, as if the nation's glorious past was being purposely left in the shadows. Emily's heart raced slightly as her blue eyes scanned the spines. She was looking for something specific, something her father had mentioned during dinner the night before, when they talked about how public schools were trying to rewrite the history of the country they loved so much. And then she saw it. Almost hidden behind a row of books on modern social theories and critiques of capitalism was the volume with the blue cover and bold letters, Trump's America. For Emily, that discovery was like finding a lighthouse in a stormy sea. Her delicate fingers touched the hardcover, feeling the texture of the material, and a shy, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips. It wasn't just a book, it was a piece of identity, a validation that what her family believed wasn't the evil that the television and her teachers claimed it was. It was the story of a strong, proud, and free America. She pulled the book from the shelf with reverent care, hugging it against her chest. The weight of the volume brought her comfort, an anchor of reality in a teenage world dominated by confusion and social pressure to conform to being politically correct. Emily looked around instinctively, a conditioned reflex of someone who knows they're holding something forbidden in the eyes of the cultural elite governing that space. The library was strangely empty in that aisle, but Emily's sense of isolation was deeper than the simple absence of people. She felt like a foreigner in her own land, a little MAGA girl, surrounded by posters on the walls, promoting radical ideologies, colorful flags that weren't old glory, and notices about inclusive language and historical equity. The environment, once neutral, now screamed a political agenda that excluded girls like her, girls who loved God, country, and the traditional family. Emily's vulnerability was palpable. She was small before the immense shelves that seemed to loom over her, judging her, oppressing her. She decided to sit right there on the floor in the aisle, unable to wait until she reached a table to turn the pages that promised arguments and facts, not just feelings and narratives. The afternoon sunlight streamed through a high window, creating a beam where dust motes danced, illuminating Emily as if she were a painting from simpler times. She opened the book, her eyes shining with curiosity and hope. For a brief moment she forgot where she was. She forgot the fear of being judged. She was immersed in reading about economic freedom, secure borders, and the pride of being American. It was a moment of pure peace, an instant of connection with a greater ideal. But peace, for patriots in hostile territory, is always ephemeral. The silence of the library was suddenly defiled not by a loud noise, but by the oppressive presence of someone approaching. These weren't ordinary footsteps. They were firm, rhythmic strides, charged with purpose and misguided authority. From the end of the aisle, the shadow projected itself before the person even appeared. It was a long, distorted shadow that covered Emily and her book, blocking the sunlight that warmed her. The air grew colder, or perhaps it was just Emily's blood freezing in her veins. She looked up slowly, fear beginning to tighten her throat. Standing before her, like a sentinel of the new moral regime, was Mrs. Vance, the head librarian. With her hair dyed an artificially vibrant purple, thick-rimmed glasses that framed eyes full of disdain, and a rigid posture of moral superiority, she didn't look like a guardian of books, but a jailer of ideas. Mrs. Vance looked down at the girl huddled on the floor, and then at the book in her arms. The woman's expression shifted from bureaucratic indifference to a scowl of absolute disgust. There was no greeting, no kindness, only a heavy silence, loaded with judgment, that lasted for seconds, that felt like hours. Emily felt tiny, an unwanted intruder. She squeezed the Trump's America book tighter, her knuckles turning white, trying to protect the only thing that made sense to her in that moment, while the ideological storm began to form above her head. She knew, with the sharp instinct of prey facing a predator, that her tranquility was over, and that her simple act of reading had become, in that woman's eyes, an unforgivable crime. The first sound to break the tense silence wasn't a scream, but a sharp tisk of Mrs. Vance's tongue against the roof of her mouth, a signal of disapproval so laden with contempt it sounded like a whip crack in the still air of the library. Emily, still sitting on the cold, hardwood floor, felt a knot form in her stomach. The librarian's shadow stretched over her, transforming the woman of average height into a looming giant. Mrs. Vance adjusted her glasses with a brusque, aggressive movement, her eyes fixed on the book cover as if staring at a radioactive object. I knew I smelled ideological rot coming from this aisle. The librarian's voice was sibilant, low, but vibrating with a contained rage about to spill over. She didn't ask the girl's name. For a radical left activist like her, Emily's individual identity didn't matter. Emily was just a symbol, a representation of everything Mrs. Vance had been indoctrinated to hate. "What do you think you're doing, girl? Bringing that fascist propaganda trash into my safe space, into my sanctuary of knowledge?" Emily, her hands visibly shaking, tried to hug the Trump's America book tighter, as if the volume could physically shield her from the acid words raining down on her. She swallowed hard, trying to find the voice her parents always told her to use, with respect before her elders. I just wanted to read, ma'am." Emily's voice came out weak, a trembling whisper. "It's for a report. I like history. My dad said that." The mention of the father figure was the trigger that detonated the explosion. Mrs. Vance let out a shrill, humorless laugh, a sound that echoed through the tall stacks, causing a few students at distant tables to raise their heads, only to quickly lower them, afraid of attracting the librarian's wrath. "Your dad," she repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "Your dad is the problem, child. People like him, who poison young minds with this toxic nationalism, with this blind patriotism, are the reason this country is broken. You aren't reading history, you are consuming hate. And I will not allow hate to flourish under my roof." Mrs. Vance took a step forward, aggressively invading Emily's personal space. The girl instinctively tried to scoot back, but her back met the solid base of the bookshelf. She was cornered. The leftist knew this and seemed to delight in the power she wielded in that moment. She brandished her clipboard as if it were a scepter of absolute moral authority. "Give me that book, now!" Vance ordered, extending a bony, demanding hand. "That material should have been purged from the collection months ago. It must have slipped through my community safety filters. We do not tolerate intolerance here, and the existence of that book is violence against every minority that walks into this library. The irony of the situation was cruel and palpable, but invisible to the aggressor. She spoke of tolerance while terrorizing a 14-year-old child. She spoke of safety while making a girl feel in imminent danger. Emily shook her head. No. Hot tears beginning to well up in her blue eyes. No. Please, I have the right to read. The First Amendment. Don't you dare quote the Constitution to me with that mouth dirty with privilege, Mrs. Vance screamed now, abandoning any pretense of professional decorum. Her face was red, distorted by the ideological fury consuming her reason. Your freedom ends where my feelings begin, and that book offends me. It offends decency. It offends progress. You MAGA people think you can just walk around spreading your archaic lies? Not on my watch. The verbal attack was relentless, a barrage of keywords and slogans memorized from radical manifestos. Emily felt dizzy. She couldn't understand how someone could hold so much hate for a simple book, for a simple political choice. She felt small, a yellow smear on the polished floor, being crushed by the weight of an ideology that accepted no questions. The sense of injustice burned in her chest, mixed with a paralyzing fear. Where were the responsible adults? Where was the protection? She looked around desperately, but the world seemed to have shrunk to that aisle and that enraged woman. The final escalation happened in the blink of an eye. Frustrated by Emily's silent refusal to hand over the book, and enraged by the girl's insolence in continuing to hold the Trump symbol, Mrs. Vance lost total control. Next to Emily was a heavy metal cart, loaded with dozens of books waiting to be reshelved. Ironically, many were Western literature classics that were slowly being removed to make way for modern and inclusive works. If you won't give it to me willingly, then you don't deserve to be here, Mrs. Vance roared. In a fit of blind fury, she grabbed the handle of the book cart. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of physical intimidation. With a violent, uncontrolled yank, she tipped the cart. Crash! The sound was deafening, like thunder cracking inside the closed room. The metal cart toppled heavily, slamming into the floor inches from Emily's knees. Dozens of books flew through the air, falling like stones, hitting the girl's legs, scattering in a chaos of paper and hardcovers. The violence of the act was shocking. Dust rose in a suffocating cloud. Emily screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and curled up, covering her head with one hand while the other still fiercely protected the Trump's America book against her heart, as if it were the only life-preserver in a shipwreck. The scene froze for a second. The overturned cart, the books scattered like corpses from a culture war, the girl sobbing on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, and the librarian standing there, panting, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, it seemed Mrs. Vance might realize the monstrosity of what she had just done. But radical ideology rarely leaves room for remorse. Instead of helping the child, she used the chaos to justify her narrative. "Look what you made me do," Mrs. Vance accused, pointing a trembling finger at the victim. "Your presence here creates chaos. You are a provocateur. Do you see this mess? It's your fault. It's the fault of your refusal to accept the rules of the new society. You are a little fascist in training, and I will ensure everyone knows it." Emily was crying copiously now, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the cover of the book she refused to let go. The humiliation was total. She felt the stares of other people, who were now approaching curiously but keeping their distance, intimidated by the librarian's ferocity. No one intervened. The fear of being cancelled, of being called an accomplice, paralyzed everyone. Emily was alone. The system, represented by that woman of twisted authority, had turned against her with full force. "Get up and get out!" screamed Mrs. Vance, kicking a Mark Twain book out of the way. "I'm calling security. I'm permanently banning you. I'm calling the school, your parents. I'm putting your picture at the entrance as persona non grata. It's over for you, girl. Your kind has no place in the future we are building." The little MAGA girl was devastated. Her safe world had crumbled. The pain in her knees where the books hit was sharp, but the pain in her soul was infinitely worse. She was being punished for loving her country, for wanting to learn, for being who she was. The injustice had a bitter, metallic taste. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing to disappear, the sound of the leftists' screams echoing in her mind like an endless nightmare. Hope seemed to have been crushed under that overturned book cart. Evil was triumphing, loud and proud, and virtue was huddled on the floor, weeping. The atmosphere in the library, once a sanctuary of peace, had transformed into an arena of psychological cruelty, where the air seemed to have been sucked out, leaving only the suffocating weight of humiliation hanging over little Emily. The little MAGA girl remained on the floor, surrounded by the literary debris that Mrs. Vance's fury had caused, her knees stinging from the impact of the hardcovers that collided against her young skin. But this physical pain was insignificant compared to the laceration in her soul. She felt exposed, naked before an unjust judgment, as if she were in a kangaroo court where the verdict had already been decided before she had even committed any crime, except the crime of thinking differently. Mrs. Vance, the living embodiment of unchecked radicalism, loomed over her like a bird of prey, ready for the final strike, her panting, irregular breath echoing in the deadly silence that had settled over the room. The few spectators present, indoctrinated college students or elderly folks fearful of confronting the new order, looked away or watched with a morbid, passive curiosity, silent accomplices to that moral execution. No one moved. No one said a word. Emily's isolation was absolute, an island of innocence about to be swallowed by a sea of progressive intolerance. Mrs. Vance, smelling fear and interpreting the surrounding silence as tacit approval of her authority, decided that verbal humiliation wasn't enough. She needed a tangible victory. She needed to confiscate the symbol of that rebellion. Her eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of her glasses, fixed with hateful greed on the Trump's America book, which Emily still pressed against her chest with the strength of desperation, her fingers white with tension, as if that object were the last anchor keeping her from being dragged into the abyss. "Enough of this theater!" hissed the librarian, her voice distilling poison. She bent down, violently invading the girl's personal space, and her hands, with nails painted in garish colors, grabbed the edge of the book. "This is state property, and I am revoking your access to it. Let go now, you insolent brat. You have no right to pollute this place with this filth." Then began a physical struggle, unequal and painful to watch. Emily, sobbing openly now, shook her head in frantic denial. "No, it's my right. Please stop," she pleaded, her voice choked with tears, while trying to pull the book back. But Mrs. Vance was a grown woman, fueled by the adrenaline of ideological hate. She pulled hard, shaking the small girl, not caring if she hurt her. "Rights! You lost your rights the moment you chose to support a monster!" shouted the activist, twisting reality to justify her aggression. With every tug, the book cover creaked, and Emily felt she was losing not just an object, but her dignity, her connection to her father's values, her very identity. It was the perfect image of modern tyranny, brute force disguised as virtue, crushing the vulnerable individual. Mrs. Vance prepared for a final violent yank, a smile of cruel triumph curling her lips, certain the girl's resistance was broken. Evil was about to claim its petty victory in the American history aisle. It was in that exact instant, in the split second, when hope seemed to have been extinguished, that the universe responded. Not with a scream, but with a sound that cut through the stale air of the library like a tempered steel blade. Thud, a dry, heavy, authoritative sound of solid wood against the floor. Thud, closer, stronger, a martial, relentless rhythm. Thud. The main door to the aisle swung open with a controlled bang, and the afternoon sunlight invaded the space, outlining a silhouette in the entrance that seemed carved from granite and history. Time seemed to slow down. Mrs. Vance froze, her hands still on the book, her head turning slowly toward the intrusion. Annoyed at having her power trip interrupted, Emily, through the tears blurring her vision, looked up and saw what looked like an apparition. There he was. Colonel Arthur Hayes. At 96, he wasn't just an elderly man. He was a living monument. He wore his full World War II dress uniform, the olive-drab fabric impeccably pressed, creases sharp as razors, polished brass buttons shining like gold stars. But what stole the breath away wasn't the fabric, it was the medals. Rows and rows of colourful ribbons and metal hung over his left chest, telling a story of bloody beaches in Normandy, of frozen forests in Bastogne, of friends lost and freedoms won at an incalculable price. He leaned on a polished oak cane, but his posture was upright, defying gravity and age, sustained by a backbone forged in military discipline. His face, marked by deep wrinkles that looked like maps of ancient battles, bore an expression of biblical severity. His grey eyes, which had stared down the face of true fascism in Europe, swept the scene with terrible clarity, registering the hysterical woman, the overturned cart, and the crying child on the floor. The veteran's presence changed the atmospheric pressure of the room. The air, previously dominated by the shrill hysteria of the leftist, was suddenly filled with a silent gravity, an aura of authority that didn't need to ask permission to exist. He took 3 more steps into the room, the sound of his military boots and the cane creating a percussion that silenced even the thoughts of those present. "Release the girl!" Colonel Hayes' voice resonated. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, deep command coming from the diaphragm, with the resonance of distant thunder announcing an inevitable storm. It was the voice of a man used to leading men to death and glory. Mrs. Vance blinked, stunned, as if woken from a trance. She released the book instinctively, stepping back, but her ideological arrogance soon tried to regain control. She adjusted her glasses, trying to recover her posture of bureaucratic superiority before this relic of the past. "Who are you? This is a restricted area. You can't just barge in here making noise and barking orders. I am the head administrator, and I am dealing with a disciplinary situation." The colonel didn't stop. He continued advancing until he physically placed himself between the librarian and the cowering girl, transforming his own frail yet indestructible body into a wall. He looked Mrs. Vance up and down with cold, analytical contempt. "Discipline?" He repeated the word, and it sounded ridiculous in his mouth. "I saw discipline in the foxholes, madame. I saw 18-year-old boys hold the line while hell rained down on their heads. What you are doing here is not discipline. It is cowardice. It is sadism." Mrs. Vance's face turned red, a mixture of shame and fury. "How dare you? Do you not know who I am? I am an educator. I'm protecting this community from hate speech. That girl—" She pointed a trembling finger at Emily, who was looking at the back of the veteran's uniform with awe. "She was spreading fascist propaganda. You should be on my side. You fought against fascism, didn't you?" Colonel Hayes let out a short, dry laugh, devoid of humor. He turned his body slowly, staring the woman in the eyes, making her back up another step. "Yes, I fought against fascism. I crossed the Atlantic on a rat-infested transport ship. I jumped into freezing water while machine guns tried to cut me in half. I saw my best friends die screaming for their mothers on the sands of France. And do you know why we did that?" He paused dramatically. The silence in the library was absolute now. We did that so a little American girl could walk into a library and read any damn book she wanted, without fear of a domestic tyrant like you." The accusation hit Mrs. Vance like a physical slap. She opened her mouth to retort, to launch into her jargon about the paradox of tolerance and emotional safety, but the words died in her throat. The moral authority of the man in front of her was crushing. He wasn't debating theories, he was presenting facts forged in blood. "You call this hate?" continued the colonel, pointing with his cane at the book fallen in Emily's lap. "The only hate in this room is coming from you, ma'am. Hate for freedom, hate for dissent. You dress yourself in virtue, dye your hair bright colors, and talk about inclusion. But your actions are identical to the brownshirts I helped defeat in 1945. They burned books too. They screamed at children too. They also thought they were on the right side of history." Mrs. Vance was backed against the shelf now, cornered by the truth. The students around began to murmur. Her narrative was crumbling. That man, that Rue veteran, had ripped the mask off her social justice and revealed the ugly face of authoritarianism underneath. She looked around, seeking support, but found none. Feeling defeated on the moral field, she resorted to the only weapon she had left: the bureaucracy of the system that protected her. "Very well," she said, her voice shaking but loaded with vindictive malice. She picked up her clipboard from the floor, trying to recover some dignity. "You may have won the crowd with your little nostalgic speech, old man, but I have the rules on my side. I have the school board. I'm going to file a report on this. I'm reporting this aggression. You will be banned, and that girl—" She shot a venomous look at Emily. "She will never step foot in here again. The system supports me. You may have the moment, but we have the power." With that final threat, the promise that the bureaucratic machine would crush what honor had saved, Mrs. Vance turned on her heels and marched away toward her office, stomping her feet like a thwarted but dangerous child. The immediate danger had passed, but the black cloud of institutional persecution still hung in the air. Colonel Hayes watched her leave until she disappeared from view. His shoulder relaxed imperceptibly. The soldier had won the battle, but he knew the war was long. He then turned slowly downward to the small figure huddled on the floor. The transition in his face was miraculous. The hard granite of the warrior softened into the expression of a gentle grandfather. The little MAGA girl was still trembling, holding her book, her large, wet eyes fixed on him as if he were an angel sent by God. The old veteran leaned his cane against the shelf and, with visible and painful effort that made his joints crack, bent one knee until he was at Emily's eye level. He removed the white glove from his right hand, revealing wrinkled and calloused skin, and extended it gently toward the girl's face. With infinite tenderness, he used his thumb to wipe a tear running down her cheek. "It's all right now, soldier," he whispered, a sad but warm smile illuminating his face. "The cavalry has arrived. No one is going to hurt you while I'm breathing." Emily, feeling the genuine kindness radiating from that stranger who seemed to know her better than anyone, let out a sob of relief, and impulsively dropped the book for a second to hug the old veteran's neck, burying her face in the cold medals that warmed her heart. Colonel Hayes, surprised for a moment, closed his eyes and returned the embrace, patting the girl's back with awkward but firm taps. There, on the library floor, surrounded by toppled books, America's glorious past embraced its uncertain future, promising that no matter how dark the night got or how loud the radicals screamed, the flame of freedom would never go out without a fight. But the threat of Mrs. Vance still echoed, and the colonel knew there was still one final lesson to be taught. Colonel Hayes's embrace didn't last forever, but the warmth of that fatherly gesture would remain etched in Emily's soul for eternity. When he finally pulled away, holding her by the shoulders with his firm, calloused hands, the girl felt a tectonic shift within herself. The paralyzing fear, that icy cold Mrs. Vance had injected into her veins with her poisonous rhetoric, had dissipated, replaced by a pillar of fire and courage emanating from the old soldier. The veteran smiled at her, a smile that crinkled the corners of his tired eyes but shone with indestructible goodness. "Let's go, little patriot," he said softly, but loud enough for everyone in the aisle to hear. "Soldiers don't stay on the ground. We get up, shake off the dust, and continue the march." With an encouraging nod, he extended his hand again, and Emily, wiping the last tears with the back of her hand, grabbed it. The pull was gentle, but decided. As she stood up, smoothing her crumpled yellow dress and fixing the pink bow in her hair, Emily was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, raised by the living history of her nation itself. The atmosphere in the library had transformed completely. Where once reigned complicit silence and fear of the librarian's tyranny, now there was a palpable electricity of respect and admiration. The students and patrons, who minutes earlier looked away, now observed the scene with reverence. The spell of fear imposed by radical ideology had been broken by the simple presence of true honor. A young man, wearing headphones and looking distant from everything, took his cell phone out of his pocket, not to ridicule, but to record the moment dignity defeated oppression. Colonel Hayes, ignoring the audience and focusing only on the mission to restore order, turned to the chaos on the floor. With the tip of his cane, he pointed to the Trump's America book, lying among scattered novels and biographies like a wounded soldier on the battlefield. "Knowledge should never be treated this way," murmured the colonel, a note of sadness in his gravelly voice. He leaned over, ignoring the evident pain in his age-curved back, and picked up the book. He held it with both hands, wiping the dust from the cover with an almost ceremonial gesture, as if polishing a medal. He examined the spine, checking for damage, and then solemnly handed it to Emily. "Mrs. Vance said this is dangerous," he said, looking deeply into the girl's eyes. "And she's right. Ideas are dangerous to tyrants. The truth is dangerous to liars. But for a free American, this here is just the fuel of freedom. Never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot think. My daughter." Emily received the book as if accepting an Olympic torch. Its weight in her hands now felt different. It was no longer a burden of shame, but a symbol of resistance. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice gaining steadiness. "But," she said, "she's going to ban me. She said the system is with her." The fear of bureaucratic retaliation, the leftists' final threat, still hung like a dark cloud. Colonel Hayes let out a low laugh, a sound recalling stones rolling at the bottom of a river. He straightened up, adjusting the military cap on his head with geometric precision. "The system," he repeated with a defiant glint in his eyes. "Mrs. Vance forgets who built the system. She forgets upon whose shoulders this nation stands." He tapped his cane on the floor again, commanding everyone's attention. "Come with me." They walked together down the central aisle of the library. The image was powerful. The old warrior in olive-drab uniform, limping slightly but advancing with unstoppable determination, and the young girl in yellow at his side, holding her book against her chest, head held high. It was the meeting of generations, the past protecting the future. They reached the main counter, where a young assistant, pale and wide-eyed with fear, waited. She had seen everything and expected the worst. The door to Mrs. Vance's office was closed, the silence inside indicating cowardice had hidden away to lick its wounds. Colonel Hayes placed his own ID card on the counter. It was an old document worn by time, but the military insignia still shone. "I would like to register the loan of this book to Miss Emily, under my responsibility," he said with impeccable courtesy, contrasting brutally with the head librarian's earlier rudeness. "And please deliver a message to Mrs. Vance when she decides to come out of her hiding hole." The colonel leaned slightly over the counter, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone, but made of steel. "Tell her that Colonel Arthur Hayes, whose name is on the bronze plaque at the entrance of this building, a plaque honoring the donors who founded this library in 1955, will be present at the next school board meeting. And tell her I'll be bringing lawyers from the American Legion with me to discuss the inclusion policies that exclude patriots." The assistant swallowed hard and nodded frantically, processing the book with trembling hands. The system Mrs. Vance threatened to use as a weapon had just been claimed by its true owner. Colonel Hayes wasn't just a nostalgic old man. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose influence transcended the petty politics of the moment. The threat of cancellation evaporated instantly before real authority. Emily looked at the colonel with wide eyes. She didn't know who he was, only that he was a hero. Now she realized he was a living legend in her own town. With the book duly stamped and legally in her possession, Emily and the colonel headed for the exit. The glass double doors opened, and the fresh afternoon air welcomed them. The sun was beginning to set, bathing the world in shades of gold and orange, a divine light that seemed to celebrate the victory of that day. In the front courtyard, the American flag fluttered gently on the pole, its vibrant colors against the blue sky. The colonel stopped there, before the flag, and instinctively straightened his posture, rendering a silent and respectful salute. Emily, watching him, felt a wave of emotion rise in her throat. She mimicked the gesture, placing her hand over her heart, clutching the book over it. "Do you know why they hate that symbol so much, Emily?" asked the colonel, without taking his eyes off the flag. "Because they think it represents oppression," ventured Emily, repeating what she heard in school. "No," corrected the colonel, turning to her. The wind ruffled his white hair, giving him an almost prophetic appearance. "They hate it because it represents responsibility. It represents the fact that freedom isn't free and that no one owes them anything. They want you to feel guilty for loving your country, because guilt is the chain with which they enslave free minds. But today," he put his hand on her shoulder again, "today you broke that chain. You didn't cry because you were wrong. You cried because you have a pure heart, and purity scares the corrupt." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a pin, a small enamel American flag pin, old and slightly worn. "I wore this on my lapel when I came home in '45, he said, pinning the brooch delicately to the pink bow in Emily's hair. "Now it is yours. Consider this a battlefield medal. You faced the enemy today, soldier, and you won." Emily touched the small pin, tears returning to her eyes, but now they were tears of joy and overflowing gratitude. "Thank you, Colonel. I don't know how to thank you. I was so scared." "Fear is natural," he replied, winking. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Emily. It's doing the right thing even when you're scared to death, and you held on to that book. You didn't let go. That is courage." A car honked on the street. It was Emily's mother, who had pulled up to the curb looking worried, but her expression soon changed to surprise and relief upon seeing her daughter talking to the distinguished military man. Colonel Hayes took a step back, leaning on his cane, satisfied with a duty fulfilled. "Go home, little MAGA girl," he said with a proud smile. "Read your book, learn your history, and never ever let them dim your light. The world is full of shadows like Mrs. Vance, but it takes just a single candle to dispel the darkness. Today, you were that candle." Emily ran toward her mother's car but stopped halfway. She turned one last time. The colonel was still there, standing under the flag, an eternal sentinel guarding freedom. She held the Trump's America book high above her head in a gesture of absolute triumph. The colonel responded with a slow, solemn salute. As the car drove away, Emily looked out the window. The library fell behind, small compared to the greatness of what had just happened. She touched the pin in her hair and opened the book on her lap. The words on the pages seemed to glow. She was no longer just a scared girl in a hostile world. She had been baptized by the fire of persecution and saved by the honor of tradition. She knew now that she wasn't alone. There was an army of patriots, visible and invisible, living and in memory, marching by her side. Justice had prevailed, tyranny had retreated into the shadows, and in young Emily's heart the flame of true patriotism burned stronger than ever, impossible to extinguish. She smiled, ready for the future, ready to help make America great again, one page at a time.